why the moon could cause the end of the world as we know it by 2030, record flooding due to moon's wobble predicted by NASA. Scientists have predicted that the moon could cause us some serious problems in or around the year 2030, so that's just 8 years away. This has inspired so many headlines claiming that the apocalypse is coming, but is that really what's happening? The moon wobble will amplify devastating coastal flooding by mid-30s, according to NASA. This new NASA study reveals that coastal flooding due to climate change will get even worse in the coming decade due to a quirk of the moon's orbit. Coastal communities already dealing with higher tides due to sea level rise from climate change. Still, a new study says that under the influence of the moon's gravitational pull, this will get much worse by the mid-2030s. The moon is closely linked with Earth's tides. As it orbits around our planet, the moon's gravitational pull tugs on the world's oceans, resulting in a bulge of water drawn towards the moon. A similar bulge is pushed away from it on the opposite side of Earth. So how close the moon is to Earth is in its elliptical orbit affects the depth of the bulge, which such that it is deeper when we have a supermoon. Tides also tend to be higher around the full moon and new moons when the Earth, moon, and sun line up in syzygy, the straight line configuration of three celestial bodies. And the NASA diagram shows the tidal bulges in Earth's oceans that result from both the moon and the sun as they line up in the new moon syzygy. The lunar bulge tracks along with the moon as it orbits Earth, while the solar tide bulge is always on the planet's day side. Both are exaggerated here in this view to make them more visible in this scale, this NASA image. So the coastal communities that were built in these tides in mind, however, the sea level rising due to climate change, high tides are reaching new heights, and high tide flooding is now more common. Cities in the United States such as Miami, Florida are already experiencing regular high tide floods, also called nuisance floods. In a new study, NASA Sea Level Change Science team at the University of Hawaii highlights another way the moon plays a role in our tides. The precession of the moon's wobble of its orbit tilt both suppresses and amplifies the tidal bulge in a recurring cycle, and their research reveals this influence is expected to make high tide flooding due to climate change even worse starting around the mid-2030s. Lead author Phil Thompson, director of the University of Hawaii Sea Level Center, said in a press release, "We expect the most rapid increases to be along U.S. Pacific and Gulf of Mexico coastlines, which include Hawaii and other Pacific islands. It's important because this is a point at which high tide flooding transitions from being primarily a local or regional issue and becomes a national issue affecting a majority of our nation's coastlines." The moon's orbit around Earth is tilted by roughly 5 degrees compared with the ecliptic, the disk in space that all the major planets trace out as they orbit around the sun. And due to this tilt, the moon spends about half its time above the ecliptic and the rest of the time below it. Now, the 2 points in the orbit where the moon crosses the ecliptic are called nodes. The position of the nodes change with time so that the moon's orbit appears to wobble in space, and that takes about 18.6 years for it to complete one entire cycle of this wobble. We've known about this cycle, called lunar nodal precession, for nearly 300 years. Still, its impending effects on us are something entirely new. In addition to all other ways the moon affects the tides, this orbital tilt has an impact of its own. During the part of the 18.6-year wobble of the moon, tidal extremes are suppressed, resulting in lower high tides and higher low tides. On the other parts of the cycle, the extremes are enhanced, producing even higher high tides and lower low tides. And according to NASA, we are currently in a period where the orientation of the wobble is enhanced by tidal extremes, while it's regularly causing high tides to excess flooding thresholds. Sea level rise is only adding a small amount. After another 10 to 15 years of further sea level rise due to climate change, however, the next period of tidal amplification by the lunar cycle is expected to be much worse. According to NASA, they said it will be a different story the next time the cycle comes around to amplify tides again in the mid-2030s. Global sea level rise will have been at work for another decade. The higher seas amplified by the lunar cycle will cause a leap in flood numbers on almost all U.S. mainland coasts, Hawaii and also Guam. This amplification will also increase the impact of storm surges. As is often the case when it comes to climate change, borders will not protect anyone. These amplified tides will also impact Canadian coastlines and coastal communities, but according to NASA, far northern coastlines in Alaska and Canadian Arctic will likely see a delayed impact as the land in those regions is currently rising due to long-term geological processes. Scientists, engineers, and decision makers are accustomed to thinking about rare high-impact events, for example, a 100-year storm, but we demonstrate that it is important to plan for extreme months or seasons during which the number of flooding episodes rather than the magnitude is exceptional, according to what Thompson explains. He says it's the accumulated effect over time that will have an impact. He says if it floods 10 or 15 times a month, a business can't keep operating with that parking lot underwater. People lose their jobs because they can't get to work. Seeping cesspools become a public health issue, things like that. Now, with the results of the study in hand, we now have a clearer picture of the flooding risks our coastal communities will be dealing with in the decade to come. While we cannot do anything to influence the moon's orbit, this kind of research helps us in two ways. First, to provide urban planners with the information they need to help their communities to adapt to the coming tides. And second, it also highlights how more rapid and effective action on climate change can reduce the worst of the impacts to come. This is from Weather Network and Bended Reality. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.